What do you do when the woman who runs your neighborhood decides she owns your property? You build a fence that divides a community and exposes a web of deceit. The afternoon sun, warm and golden, beat down on the placid waters of Lake Everwood. A perfect summer day that felt like a postcard from a simpler time. Yet for Arthur Vance, a quiet contracts lawyer, a profound unease was beginning to settle in. He had moved to Everwood Point 5 years ago, drawn by the promise of shared lakefront access, a narrow strip of sandy beach and a small wooden dock to be enjoyed by the 5 homes on his side of the cove. This communal slice of paradise, where children chased minnows and families watched sunsets, was the very heart of the community. The first few years were idyllic. Arthur spent countless hours with his 2 young children by the water, building sandcastles and fishing until the stars emerged. It was a place of memory-making, a tranquil backdrop to a life well-lived. But then came the ascension of Penelope Vance to the Homeowners Association presidency, an imposing woman with a penchant for rigid order and a tightly wound bun. Her tenure began with a flurry of new regulations. Lawns were inspected, fines levied for misplaced recycling bins, and even a decorative birdhouse required a formal application. The neighborhood, once a haven of relaxed living, began to feel less like a community and more like a carefully managed theme park. The real trouble, however, arrived with Penelope's sister Evelyn, a woman with a taste for the extravagant who descended on Everwood Point for an extended stay. It quickly became clear that the new HOA rules did not apply to her. Arthur first noticed the shift when Evelyn began to colonize the shared lakefront. It started innocuously enough with a single oversized lounge chair, but soon grew into an entire outdoor sanctuary. A dozen chairs, a heavy-duty portable bar, and speakers that boomed music across the water from sunrise to sunset. The final insult was the construction of a large wooden ramp, clearly designed for a personal watercraft. This entire setup completely obstructed the view and blocked the only public access point to the dock. Arthur, wanting to avoid conflict, approached Evelyn with a friendly smile. "Hello, I'm Arthur. I just wanted to introduce myself and mention that this is a shared space. We all use this area to get to the water." Evelyn, without looking up from her phone, waved a manicured hand dismissively. "I know," she said, her voice dripping with condescension. "Penelope gave me a reassignment. It's all official." She then gestured to a laminated piece of paper lying on the bar. "You can file a complaint with the board if you have a problem." Skeptical, Arthur glanced at the document. It was a hastily typed note claiming the HOA had unanimously voted to grant Evelyn exclusive access to her half of the shared space, citing better resource management. This was a bold-faced lie. Arthur knew at least 2 board members were out of the country during the alleged vote. His suspicions confirmed, Arthur began his investigation, contacting the city planning office and the county property records department. Both confirmed that the lakefront strip was deeded to the 5 properties in the cove, including his own. An HOA vote, regardless of its legitimacy, cannot override a property deed. The document Evelyn had flaunted was, in legal terms, utterly meaningless. At the next HOA meeting, Arthur presented his findings. The response from Penelope was pure, unadulterated fury. Her face turned a fiery red as she pounded her fist on the podium. "The HOA has recently amended its bylaws," she shrieked, her voice shaking with rage, "to allow full control of all waterfront decisions. Any challenge to the board will result in a daily fine of $500. She even produced another so-called bylaw amendment, one that no one had ever seen or voted on, which supposedly gave the board the power to seize control of all communal property. The absurdity of it all was breathtaking. Meanwhile, Evelyn's lakefront empire continued to expand. She hosted loud, boisterous parties, her guests leaving a trail of litter and empty bottles on the sandy beach. The music never stopped. The jet ski ramp, half-finished but imposing, stood like a monument to their audacity. The final straw came one morning when Arthur's 8-year-old daughter Chloe wanted to go for a swim. She walked toward the water only to be physically blocked by Evelyn. "This is
private property. You're trespassing." Chloe, a sensitive and shy child, returned to the house with tears in her eyes. The sight of his daughter, heartbroken and confused, was the moment Arthur knew he had to act. For the next week, Arthur was a man on a mission. As a contracts lawyer, this was his home turf. He meticulously reviewed his home purchase agreement, the property survey, the HOA charter, and decades of meeting minutes. What he found was an ironclad case. The HOA charter explicitly stated it had no jurisdiction over deeded rights, and any attempt to interfere would open the board up to personal liability. He drafted a formal notice and sent it via certified mail to both Penelope and Evelyn. They had 72 hours to remove all their belongings from the shared space or face legal action. Unsurprisingly, they did not take him seriously. On the third day, Penelope appeared on Arthur's doorstep in a cloud of indignation, flanked by Evelyn and a man who introduced himself as their lawyer. He looked like he had just graduated from law school, his suit ill-fitting and his confidence wavering. They tried it all: threats, bizarre legal theories, and even a last-ditch attempt at bribery. Penelope offered to waive Arthur's HOA fees for a year if he just dropped the matter. Evelyn proposed a shared schedule, offering to use the space only on Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays. The so-called lawyer mumbled something about squatters' rights, earning a polite but firm request from Arthur to leave. The 72 hours passed without a single item being removed. In fact, Evelyn seemed to double down, expanding her setup and even beginning construction on a permanent shade pavilion.
So Arthur launched Phase 2. He hired a licensed surveyor to mark the exact boundaries of the shared lakefront, down to the last inch. The surveyor's findings confirmed his suspicion. The space was evenly split, and Evelyn's entire resort sprawled well across both halves. Armed with the survey, Arthur visited the local lumberyard and ordered enough fencing to make a statement. The clerk's eyes widened as Arthur calmly explained where the materials were going. Word spread like wildfire. By the time Arthur returned home, the neighborhood was abuzz with speculation. When asked, he simply replied, "I'm just marking the property lines." At sunrise the next morning, a full crew arrived at the lakefront. They had permits, the survey, and a purpose. The fence went up swiftly and surely, a line of fresh lumber that sliced through the grass and sand, a perfect divide between what was his and what was theirs. It extended all the way to the water's edge, even bisecting the community dock. It was a physical and poetic statement. Evelyn emerged from her cottage just as the final panels blocked her access to her favorite lounge chair. Her coffee mug slipped from her grasp and shattered on the deck. A moment later, Penelope arrived, still in her bathrobe and curlers, followed by half the neighborhood. The ensuing scene was a spectacle of pure fury. Penelope screamed accusations of trespassing and vandalism. She called the local police, who, after reviewing Arthur's paperwork, simply shrugged and left. She then called city code enforcement, who found no violations. Undeterred, Penelope vowed to contact higher authorities, escalating from City Hall to, as one neighbor later joked, the federal government itself. Meanwhile, the fence had rendered Evelyn's elaborate setup comically useless. Half of her jet ski ramp was now stranded behind a wooden wall. Her shade pavilion stood with its posts on either side of the fence, a permanent, bizarre monument to a failed power grab. That evening, the emergency HOA meeting was packed. Penelope had circulated flyers declaring Arthur a neighborhood menace, but her plan backfired spectacularly. Other homeowners, emboldened by Arthur's stand, had been doing their own research. A retired judge, Thomas Harrison, stood and calmly laid out the legal violations committed by the board. Sarah Chen, whose prized rose garden had been destroyed by one of Penelope's projects, followed with her own damning findings. One by one, neighbors stood up, exposing Penelope's web of favoritism and corruption. Then Evelyn's husband, a quiet man with short brown hair, a neatly trimmed beard, wearing a plain gray t-shirt and dark jeans, who had wisely stayed out of the conflict, arrived. He took one look at the fence, his furious wife, and the brewing legal storm, and made a swift decision. They were leaving. As he began dismantling Evelyn's setup, neighbors overheard him muttering about how Penelope had dragged them into an expensive and very public mess. Penelope's final attempt to regain control was to declare an executive order to have the fence torn down. But the HOA's attorney, a man with a sharp suit, slicked back dark hair, and a tired expression, who had remained silent throughout the chaos, finally spoke. He He stated in no uncertain terms that Penelope had overstepped her authority and exposed the HOA to significant legal action. He concluded by recommending her immediate removal from office. The vote was instant and unanimous. That, however, was not the end of it. The new board, with Arthur's help, voted to press criminal charges. An audit revealed Penelope had funneled HOA funds toward Evelyn's bogus paperwork and had been skimming from the landscaping budget to pad her sister's husband's paychecks. 3 months later, Penelope Vance stood before a judge charged with fraud, embezzlement, and breach of fiduciary duty. The verdict was guilty. She was sentenced to 2 years of probation, 300 hours of community service, and ordered to pay restitution of $47,000 to the HOA. As the judge's gavel fell, Penelope crumpled into a chair, her reign of terror finally at an end. And as for Arthur, he still sits by the water on quiet mornings, a cup of coffee in hand, admiring the perfectly straight fence that now stands as a monument to justice. The peace of Lake Everwood has been restored, not by force or threats, but by the quiet power of a man who simply decided to draw a line in the sand. And what a line it was.